When Thomas Jefferson became president in 1800, our nation was less than 25 years old. It was fragile and susceptible to attack from England or other European powers. The port of New Orleans was seen as especially troublesome as it controlled access to settlements along the Mississippi River, the current western border of the United States. The mid-continent was controlled by France, which had recently acquired those rights from Spain. In 1801, President Jefferson sent a delegation to Paris with an offer to purchase the New Orleans port from France. That offer reached Napoleon at a critical time. Wars with European neighbors had left Napoleon with mounting debt. Furthermore, a slave uprising in Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, had driven out the wealthy French plantation owners, further depressing the French economy. Plantation profits from Hispaniola had been a major source of revenue for the French government. Napoleon realized that France could not defend its remaining holdings in North America. What began with an offer to buy New Orleans port ended with the French offering to sell the entire Louisiana territory. The American negotiators quickly accepted Napoleon's bargain asking price of $15 million, and Jefferson convinced Congress to ratify the deal. Now America controlled the continent from the Atlantic seaboard to the Rockies, and Americans began to view the entire continent as their rightful destiny. North America was a huge landmass, and transportation of people and goods across the landmass from east to west was very difficult. In colonial times, the colonies were lined up along the Atlantic seaboard, and getting from colony to colony had been accomplished the easy way, by boat. However, there was no obvious water route across the continent. Scientists speculated that there was a continental divide with rivers flowing east and west from that divide. They speculated, for example, that settlers in the east could take the Ohio River to the Mississippi and then up the Missouri to its headwaters. They could then portage across the continental divide to the headwaters of a western river that would carry them down to the Pacific Ocean. That was the theory. A decade earlier, Captain Robert Gray sailed 13 miles up the Columbia River from the Pacific, and he named the river after his sailboat, the Columbia Rediviva. News of his discovery reached the East Coast, where Americans were now sure that Western exploration would soon find a practical Northwest passage across the divide to the headwaters of the Columbia. President Jefferson's interests in an expedition, however, went far beyond finding a Northwest passage. This was the age of discovery. Explorers like Captain James Cook and Alexander von Humboldt were returning from distant shores with new, strange, and marvelous plants. Cultivating those alien plants had become all the rage in Europe and America. Jefferson was constantly experimenting with new plants at his estate in Monticello, and he exchanged seeds and cuttings and corresponded with leading botanists throughout the colonies and Europe. Jefferson loved plants. The greatest service which can be rendered any country, he wrote, is to add a useful plant to its culture. Jefferson could only imagine what botanical discoveries lay west of the United States beyond the Mississippi. The nation looked to botany for answers. Food was always in short supply, and Americans looked to botany for new sources. They also saw botany as the key to medical advances. Medicine was still in its infancy. Most Americans relied on the local botanist or herbalist, someone well-versed in using herbal concoctions to treat illnesses. Medical schools emphasized the importance of botany. For all those reasons, Jefferson, as president, moved aggressively with his plan for a government-sponsored expedition across the continent. This expedition would be fraught with danger. Hostile native tribes could attack the explorers. Foreign soldiers could overwhelm them. The land itself was treacherous. He couldn't send scientists who were unlikely to have the necessary survival skills. He needed a small group of frontiersmen who knew how to handle themselves, men who were strong, courageous, and with military experience. Nonetheless, scientific exploration had to be included. Jefferson needed a frontiersman as leader who really knew the natural world and who could be taught to explore the wilderness and identify, document, and preserve specimens of new plants. One of Jefferson's strengths as a leader was his ability to recognize and exploit talent. While visiting the plantation of a Virginia neighbor, William Lewis, Jefferson had occasion to interact with William's son, Meriwether. Jefferson was struck by Meriwether's unusual powers of observation, attention to detail, and voracious appetite to understand the natural world. Meriwether also had military experience. His knowledge of plants was also already impressive. He had absorbed a great deal from his mother, Lucy, who was esteemed throughout Virginia as a knowledgeable and gifted herbalist. He accompanied her on many foraging treks. She had taught him how to identify medicinal plants and how to prepare and use them. When he became president, Jefferson hired Meriwether as his personal assistant, but almost immediately began preparing him for a westward expedition, running him through a curriculum that would frighten many a graduate student today. Jefferson offered Lewis the chance to lead this government-sponsored westward expedition. Lewis accepted and asked his old mentor, William Clark, who had been his military commander, to join him as co-captain. Clark was more seasoned as an explorer and was a master map maker. Lewis would himself take the lead in documenting the flora of the West. Jefferson tutored Lewis personally and then sent him to Philadelphia to study with major scholars. This included medical training with Dr. Benjamin Rush, anatomy with Caspar Wistar, mathematics with Robert Patterson, and astronomy with Andrew Ellicott. Jefferson made special arrangements to have Meriwether spend significant time with the distinguished botanist Benjamin Smith Barton, who proceeded to teach Lewis how to dry, preserve, store, and label plant specimens. Barton's greatest challenge was teaching Lewis how to know what plants were new to science, so time and resources would not be wasted on plants already known. Fortunately, like Jefferson, Barton discovered that Lewis was unusually knowledgeable about plants for someone without formal training. Lewis was also an eager and quick learner. Along with the training, Lewis gathered a small library of books which he took with him on the expedition. These included Barton's own text on botany and a 2-volume set of Linnaeus' system of classifying plants and animals. The expedition launched on May of 1804. By October of 1804, the expedition had reached a large Mandan and Hidatsa village where the explorers built a winter encampment called Fort Mandan, a few miles from present-day Washburn, North Dakota. There were several white fur traders in the area, and one, Toussaint Charbonneau, seemed especially knowledgeable. He spoke French and some Mandan. Several years earlier, Charbonneau had purchased 2 native Indian girls from the Hidatsa and made them his wives. One was Sacagawea, an Idaho-born Shoshone, who had been kidnapped by a Hidatsa war party. Lewis hired Charbonneau to accompany the corps and serve as translator, and to bring his wife Sacagawea, now 16 or 17 years old, and her newborn son, Jean-Baptiste. Sacagawea was from the area around present-day Salmon, Idaho. She was to play a pivotal role from this point on, facilitating friendly relations with native tribes, helping to secure horses from the Shoshone, and sharing her knowledge of Western plants. By August of 1805, the expedition was on the western border of Montana. Lewis tasted salmon for the first time, which gave him hope that he would soon see the Pacific Ocean. When the corps ascended the Continental Divide, the men stared westward across the valley into the daunting Bitterroot Range. Seeing row after row of mountains receding into the west, Lewis was crestfallen. The mental scene he had formed of an easy descent to the Pacific had been a pipe dream. The short portage that he had envisioned turned out to be over 400 miles of treacherous terrain. Crossing the Bitterroot Range proved to be the most grueling and dangerous phase of the expedition. The trek was perilous, and the explorers were aware that they were no longer in the United States. By the time the corps cleared the Bitterroots, the explorers also faced starvation. The Shoshone teenage mother, Sacagawea, rescued the party by collecting camas roots, Camassia quamash. The explorers had already encountered a field of camas with pale blue flowers that Lewis said looked like lakes of fine, clear water. But now the camas bulbs provided much needed nourishment. Camas roots had been an important food source among the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, and other Western tribes for generations. When some explorers suffered abdominal bloating caused by the camas root, Sacagawea again came to the rescue by gathering roots of Western Sweet Sicily, Osmorrhiza occidentalis. The roots had a pleasant taste like anise seed and provided relief. Sacagawea knew what roots, leaves, berries, stems, and bark were edible, poisonous, medicinal, or useful for baskets, nets, clothing, and ornamentation. She knew how to prepare food from many of the plants they encountered. In all, Lewis and Clark identified almost 150 plants new to science on their expedition, many of those which had been found in Idaho. Several like wild mock orange, Philadelphus lewisii, bitterroot, Lewisia rediviva, and Lewis's prairie flax, Linum lewisii, were named in honor of Meriwether Lewis. A new genus, Clarkia, with over 40 species, including ragged robin, Clarkia pulchella, was named in honor of William Clark. Most of the plants in the Lewis collection were given names by Friedrich Persch, a mercurial German botanist who had been hired to organize the Lewis and Clark collection. Among the plants that Lewis and Clark discovered was wild mock orange, Philadelphus lewisii, which Meriwether Lewis discovered in early May of 1806 on the return trip, shortly after the Corps had reached the Clearwater. This native shrub, which produces a profusion of white flowers in the spring with a slight orange fragrance, was later chosen as Idaho's state flower. Meriwether Lewis was not a graceful writer, but his journal entries are remarkable for their careful attention to detail. One of his most detailed plant descriptions was for ragged robin, Clarkia pulchella, again discovered near the Clearwater River. A small sample of his description will give you some idea of how enthusiastically he had absorbed the vocabulary of botany at the time. The calyx is a one-flowered spathe. The corolla superior consists of 4 pale purple petals, which are tripartite. The central lobe largest, and all terminate obtusely. They are inserted with a long and narrow claw on the top of the germ, are long, smooth, and deciduous. The Lewis and Clark expedition remains today one of the defining sagas in American history. The contributions of Thomas Jefferson, Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and Sacagawea still resonate today as heroic. A decade after the expedition, had ended, Friedrich Persch, who was then cataloging Lewis's collection of plants, wrote the following: "When I consider that the small collection communicated to me, consisting of about 150 specimens, contained not above a dozen plants well known to me to be natives of North America, the rest being either entirely new or but little known, and among them at least 6 distinct and new genera. This may give an idea of the discerning eye of their collector, Meriwether Lewis." Lewis had been charged by the President of the United States with creating workable maps, recording altitude and weather conditions, keeping detailed records of longitude and latitude, identifying new minerals and mineral deposits, gathering cultural information about native tribes, identifying, documenting, and preserving specimens of plants and animals new to science, and paying special attention to navigable water passages. Given the scope and breadth of his other responsibilities, those who have studied Meriwether Lewis have concluded that his contributions to American botany were staggering. Meriwether Lewis will always have a place in the pantheon of major American botanists. And with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Anne de Bolt.
Thank you, Tom. Let's see if I can make this work. Let's see, I think I need glasses. All right. Thank you, Tom. That was fantastic. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Just wanted to check on that. So also, Vicky, can you see me? Do I have my video on or?
I can see you and I can see your PowerPoint also.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
You're great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oops. All right. Well, thank you, Tom. That was fantastic. I learned some things, and we are going to, my part of the presentation tonight is to go over a little bit more on some of the plants specifically, and then some of the plant collection information, which, as Tom laid out, is quite vast. So I think I'll just go ahead and dive into this. My section will take just a tad longer than Tom, and then as Vicki mentioned, if you could just continue to type in your questions as we go along, Tom and I will tag team answering those when I'm finished speaking. So let's just dive in. I love this quote from Meriwether Lewis. As we passed on, it seemed those scenes of visionary enchantment would never have an end. So he was an incredible person, probably a genius. I imagine maybe William Clark might have been a genius as well. And I don't think Tom mentioned that during the expedition of the 28 men, no one died except one person early on who probably had a ruptured appendix. So that is really remarkable that they took this, spent 3 years on this journey through uncharted territory by at least European people, and came back with everyone alive. And it's probably largely due to Sacagawea, who was an incredible asset for them. And they were very wise to have hired Sacagawea and Charbonneau along the way there at the Fort Mandan village. Sorry, I have to put my glasses on. One thing Tom did not mention, and I'll just get this over with out of the way, is that unfortunately Meriwether Lewis met an early demise at only the age of 35. When I first started working in the Lewis and Clark Native Plant Garden at the Idaho Botanical Garden here in Boise, it seemed like there was more debate over whether it was a murder or a suicide. It was during the bicentennial, we kicked off the Lewis and Clark Garden here in Boise. There was quite a bit of discussion about this, but in my recent readings, it really is based on some of the things that you can see here. I'm not going to read all of that, but it's there for you, for your benefit, that really it was probably most likely suicide and extremely tragic loss. Just 3 years after they had returned. They returned in 1806 in the fall, and Meriwether Lewis died then in October of 1809. So very tremendous loss. It's hard to imagine, what else he would have gotten done if he had lived a little bit longer even. Once during the time period after they returned in 1806, Meriwether Lewis was able to pack it up, the incredible collections that he had made during the expedition, and pass them on to Jefferson, and then to Philadelphia botanist Benjamin Barton, who Tom mentioned, and also he mentioned Frederick Persh, and they began working on describing the collection. Persh ended up taking off back to Europe. He was of German descent, and he went back to Europe, where he was able to kind of lock himself in a room and have plenty of alcohol, I think, to drink from the accounts that you read, and was able in 1813 then to publish the Flora Americae Septentrionalis. His flora included 132 Meriwether Lewis plants. In that book, here's an image of Clarkia right here, which Tom discussed, and I will discuss a little bit more as well. So of the collection from, there's differing numbers that you'll hear about, but 94 of the plants that Meriwether Lewis collected were new plant species names, 40 of which are still in use today. So that is very remarkable, incredible contribution to science. Frederick Persh published this book, 2-volume compendium in 1813, which included those 132 specimens collected by Meriwether Lewis. This is kind of what it looks like. And the full title, which is outlined here, these characteristic of the day, very long titles to these books. The abbreviated or short version is at the top there. But this compendium accounted for more than 3,000 North American plants, including the 132 collected by Meriwether Lewis. And so pretty remarkable body of work that he was able to produce in that period of time. And just really quite a productive person, in spite of the accounts that you read of his tendency to drink a fair amount. But it seems like a lot of people drank a fair amount back in those days. Had Persh not been so persistent in taking these plants actually with him and compiling this information, we don't really know if it would have ever made it into, if they would have ever been given credit for the many botanical discoveries that they made. So we really can, give kudos to Frederick Persh for pulling that off, because as we know, Meriwether Lewis was unable to do that, and that wasn't really his job. These are some illustrations from the book that Persh published in 1813. Just a number of the plants here shown are from that large volume compendium. And I want to just emphasize that what is incredible is the status of the collection today. It really wasn't consolidated. Some of the specimens were lost for a number of years, and it really wasn't all consolidated or largely consolidated in one place, the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, until 1899, so almost 100 years after they returned from the expedition. That collection at Philadelphia includes 239 preserved herbarium sheets, most of them obtained by Meriwether Lewis and Clark on their expedition. 10 additional specimens are remain in queue in England at the Royal Botanic Garden, and 232 of the specimens are thought to have been actually collected by Lewis. There's 7 that might have been collected by other people over time, Nuttall and others that collected shortly after the expedition. The majority of the plant specimens that survived were obtained in 1804 and 1806 because they lost 2 different main caches of their herbarium specimens in flooded water. They cached it in the ground, didn't realize the rivers would come up so high. Must have been a wet winter or a long winter, a lot of snow melt. And so they lost all these valuable collections, which must have just been heartbreaking. If any of you out there listening tonight have ever made plant collections, it's a lot of work, and it's especially a lot of work if you're camping out and there are mosquitoes and it's cold and you don't have electricity and that sort of thing. So it's really remarkable that there are as many surviving today as there are. It's thought that about 30 specimens are missing. Winter fat is a common shrub in the Western US that was among them, and a couple of others. But during the bicentennial, I think it was probably 2005, if you were around at that time, especially here in the Treasure Valley, the Historical Museum was able to obtain for about 3-month period of time 4 of the collections, the actual collections that Meriwether made, and they were housed under glass at the museum here in Boise for several months during that time frame, during the celebration. So in 1999, Jim Reveal, Ernie Schuyler, and Gary Moulton summarized for the first time really a lot of the technical information from the collections that Meriwether made, and that document is right here. Gary Moulton is a well-known historian, Lewis and Clark in particular, and worked on the journals of the expedition. And in 1999, he published the 12th volume, which we have here at home, which we purchased a number of years ago, but it actually shows it has photos of the entire herbarium of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So it's really a nice publication to have if you're interested in this subject. You can still buy it today, but I was really excited. He came and spoke in Boise several times, so we were able to acquire this. But this volume includes the images and information on each of the actual and purported collections. And I do want to mention Jim Reveal worked really hard. He was not just an incredible buckwheat expert, Eriogonum expert, but he was also quite the botanical historian and contributed significantly to this document I mentioned here, but also to this website that you can look up a lot of information on the expedition and the botanical resources that they recorded and documented during that time period. Here's what the specimens look like within the book. These are photos of the book that I just showed you from Gary Moulton, and I chose plants that you might be familiar with: gray rabbit brush, woolly sunflower, also known as Oregon sunshine, Oregon grape here, and then kinnikinick on the right. So these are what the specimens look like today, or at least at the time, 1999, when the photos were taken of the specimens. And you can see all these annotation labels. I worked in a herbarium in college, and so when visiting botanists come and evaluate a species or a genus, they will make annotations if they see something that needs to be corrected on the specimen. So you can see a bit of that's been done on these specimens over time. In 2003, then, this is a wonderful book. If you haven't seen this, and if you're interested in this topic, Lewis and Clark's Green World, the Expedition and Its Plants. Dr. Scott Earl, who was actually a surgeon, lived in Boise for a time and up in Sun Valley, wrote Central Idaho Wildflower book as well. He collaborated with Jim Reveal again on this fantastic book. It's about 250 pages. It's sort of my go-to book when I am working on a presentation or looking up something about the expedition or even just general plant information. They have a lot about each species that was collected by Meriwether Lewis, excellent photographs, ethnobotanical information, distribution of these plants, locations where they were first collected. And the book is arranged by from east to west, and it's really kind of cool. They show the segment that this chapter is about and what plants. If you can see that list of plants there that were collected during in that particular section. So it's really a nice little book to peruse, have on your shelf if you're interested in these particular plant species. This is a partial list of what they collected. It was hard. I just had to go to, I think, 6 or 7 point font to fit this on the page. But a partial list, about 125 species listed here. Again, they collected nearly 250, 239 or so still known in herbarium collections. And I just wanted you to kind of get an idea. If you glance down this list, you'll probably see many that you are familiar with. The ones that are in bold are those that I will talk a little bit more about in just a minute. So anyway, it's just kind of fun to see it all mostly put together in a list of the massive amount of work that was done during the expedition. Tom hit on a couple of these plants a little bit. It doesn't hurt to reiterate that Meriwether Lewis was recognized later on by botanists in the naming of a number of plant species listed here. You can see the Lewis blue flax, Lewis's monkey flower, the bitterroot, for which he is the genus is named for him, and then Lewis mock orange. And we're just going to look at a few pictures of each of these and talk about them in a little bit of detail so you can appreciate them even more than you might already. So I have some quotes incorporated into my presentation. I won't necessarily go through and read those for you, but I also tried to include like the where the plant was first collected. So for example, here in the valleys of the Rocky Mountains on July 9th in 1806. And here in the journals, it was noted that the Native Americans used Lewis flax extensively because of the tough fibers of the stem material for making fishing nets, ropes, and other cordage. And he thought that this plant might have great commercial potential back in the East once he returned from the expedition. Here's what Lewis flax looks like in a little bit of mass planting. And here it is growing. I'm not going to talk about blanket flower, but these photos are taken at the Lewis and Clark Garden in Boise here, blanket flower and Lewis flax growing in combination. And then just some of the signage that is within that garden here in the Boise area. Lewis monkey flower is just a stunning plant, incredibly beautiful, about 2 feet tall approximately, always grows in seepy areas, little springs. Very excellent for attracting pollinators such as sphinx moths and hummingbirds. I've tried to grow this. I tried to grow it at the Lewis and Clark Garden here in Boise, and it was it could survive for a while, but it was really hard to keep it alive. I've never discovered the trick for growing this plant. This is what it looks like in its kind of typical spring type habitat. If you're familiar with the Boise Treasure Valley area, we'll often see this if we go up Morris Mountain in the summertime, say in July or so, you'll see this flowering. Bitterroot, it's hard to say too much about the incredible Lewisia rediviva. Bitterroot was collected by Meriwether Lewis in 1806. And the pressed dried specimen, when he returned, they noticed that it looked like it was still alive. And so when that plant was planted in the garden, it did continue to grow. So the rediviva name means restored to life. So that plant was still alive, even though it had been pressed for at least half a year or so. Beautiful illustration by William Hooker there, done in 1863, kind of a famous botanical illustration. This is the range of bitterroot. Just of course, it's not continuous throughout this gray zone, but just to give you an idea of it, it is fairly widespread. It's the state flower for Montana, and in Montana, they love this plant. Little films, documentaries have been made about the bitterroot. A book was written by a former park ranger about bitterroot. So it's really a celebrated plant. And of course, there's the Bitterroot River and Valley and mountains and many place names after the bitterroot plant. This is what it can look like. If you haven't seen it, you can grow this plant fairly easily, I guess you would say. That's what the little leaves look like. So it grows the leaves, and then those are retracted into the ground and it puts out the flowers. And then, so that's why it looks so peculiar here with no leaves at the time of flowering. Again, there it is in full flower. These are seed capsules. Once fertilized and the seeds ripen in here, they become very papery and they roll around into these gravelly sites, these windswept sites often is where you'll find bitterroot, and that's how the seed is dispersed. So it's really a wonderful species to find, and this is what the roots do look like. Of course, it was a famous plant, very important for indigenous peoples. A number of different tribes, the Blackfoot, the Flathead, the Nez Perce, all collected the roots for the bitterroot, and this is what it looks like when you are getting ready to cook it up. So really a fascinating plant on the landscape in the Western US here. Tom mentioned Philadelphus or mock orange. or syringa. This photo shows kind of what the signs are like in the Lewis and Clark Garden in Boise here. It was collected in a couple of different locations, both in May and then on July 4th. Near Boise, I always think of mock orange flowering in early June, and its fragrance really does resemble that of orange blossoms. It's just heavenly scent. It grows along the Payette River. I was on the Smith River in Montana last year, and it just lined that river for 3 days when it was flowering in July up that far north, and it was just fantastic to smell that scent. It's a wonderful plant to grow in the garden. And fire-wise to boot. So if you don't have any Philadelphus in your landscape, you might want to incorporate it. So it's commercially available pretty readily. Tom also did mention Clarkia, but you can't say, again, kind of like bitterroot, you can't say too much about Clarkia. It's so unique. This is what the actual specimen looks like today. Does not do it justice, but Frederick Persh did name Clarkia for Captain William Clark. So he does have a whole genus of plants named for him, which is wonderful. Clark is a Western North American genus with more than 40 species, most of them found in California. Here in Idaho, we have the beautiful Clarkia pulchella, which I'll show a couple of photos of, which Tom also showed you. And then Clarkia rhomboidea is also here in Idaho. Both of them are annual species. Again, just incredibly brilliant pink. It's easy to recognize, known for several common names, Clarkia ragged robin, a couple of other names I can't think of at the moment, but just that's what it looks like close up. Just incredibly beautiful flower. In the old days, before everything burned up around Boise, in June you would see pink all over the hillsides east of town here, and just from all the Clarkia flowering in the foothills of Boise. We grew this at the Idaho Botanical Garden for the Lewis and Clark Garden, and this is what the little seedlings look like. It's very easy to grow from seeds. So if you ever get a chance, you might kind of explore growing Clarkia pulchella. And this is what it looks like in mass. This photo was taken a couple of years ago out in the Oahe. It's a little bit subdued color. I think it was harsh lighting that day, but not as brilliant pink or magenta almost as you'll often see this wonderful species. Bitterbrush was collected by Meriwether Lewis, the prairie of the Knobs in Nevada Valley and Powell County in central Montana in July of 1806. Most of you are probably familiar with bitterbrush. It's a very common shrub in our region, especially prior to devastating fires, I guess you would say. But bitterbrush is in the rose family. This is what Meriwether's specimen looks like today. So Persh gave the antelope bitterbrush in his publication in 1813 in the flora that he produced the scientific name Tegeria tridentata, because it has those three-tipped, three dentations in the little leaf tips. But later on, French botanist de Candolle pointed out that the plant was not really in that genus. And instead, this plant represented a very new genus, which he named for Frederick Persh. So that's nice that Persh had a whole genus named for him. And there you see the complete scientific name at the bottom there, indicating that Persh was the first person to name it, and then de Candolle came along, and that's how the annotation that you would use for a plant species. The blue camas, Tom mentioned also, just to give a few more quotes here on the blue camas collected on June 3rd in 1806. And then you can note that both William Clark and Meriwether Lewis provided quotes or wrote about this plant in their journal. And note here, William Clark in 1805, that the women were busily employed in gathering and drying the root of which they had great quantities dug in piles. So the blue camas, if you haven't seen it, this is what Meriwether's actual specimen looks like. There's no bulb left on this specimen. Again, you can see all these different labels, including the originals and annotation labels. This is what the bulbs look like. If you haven't seen those before, camas grows in ephemerally moist areas along streams, wet areas, and typically around our region. I think of it flowering around Memorial Day or the first week of June, depending on the elevation, of course. This was where we had it planted in quantity at the Botanical Garden, and I just wanted to incorporate this quote from Meriwether Lewis. When I think about him pressing these plants and knowing how much work it is, much less writing all the notes and the detail and drawing things out, doing the work that they did while the mosquitoes were attacking them, it makes it all the more impressive to think about their accomplishments, because many of us are not big mosquito fans. And so I love that he says, my dog even howls with the torture he experiences from the mosquitoes. So it gives you an idea of how difficult it really was to some extent. Photo, former outdoor writer for the Idaho Statesman, Pete Zamowski, took this beautiful photo, which he's shared on the internet, of the camas prairie. And then a couple of photos here showing our mass. We planted about 1,000 blue camas bulbs at the Botanical Garden here in Boise. And that is what it looked like one of the years. And this was a sort of a dugout canoe that was made by a couple of staff members there that we put in the wetland area for a while. A plant we maybe are not that familiar with is Indian potato or northern yampa, Paradoridia, now known as Montana, formerly Gardneri. This, as you can see by the umbel and the shape of the flowers, is in the carrot or fennel or parsley family. But it is a fairly widespread plant in the western US, a couple of different species. But there was no known specimen of this in existence today. It was either lost or not collected. Probably lost perhaps in one of those floods. That is not known. But as you can see here by this 1805 journal entry by Meriwether, that the Indian women collecting the root of a species of fennel, which grows in the moist grounds, and feeding their poor starved children. It is really distressing to witness the situation of those poor wretches. So I believe that Indian potato is a common name for this, was probably less known than some of these other species, but we did grow it at the Botanical Garden here in Boise, and that's what those little bulbs look like. I just wanted you to show you that. Very interesting to see these and think about what was below ground of some of these plants that was then required for digging up to make a good voucher specimen by Meriwether Lewis back in the day. Arrowleaf balsam root, it's a very important widespread wildflower in the western US, and it occurs, I believe, in almost every western state. And here's Lewis's quote: "The stem is eaten by the natives without any preparation." So that would be the stems of the leaves, most likely. That is the part that was known to be a food source by indigenous people, as well as other parts as well. But this is what the plant looks like in the herbarium there in Philadelphia today. You can see it actually has flower and leaf, and so you could even recognize that plant. Unlike some of the materials are quite decomposed or degraded, given that they're more than 200 years old. And here a quote from William Clark observed that parties of women and boys in search of herbs and roots to subsist on, many of them had parcels of the stems of the sunflower, which is what they were talking about here, of the beautiful arrowleaf balsam root, which again is a very widespread plant in our region. Most of you probably are familiar with it. In addition to the leaf stalks, the roots and the seeds are also edible of the arrowleaf balsam root, Balsamorhiza sagittata. And from archaeologists that I know, they have told me that the roots were cooked for 2 to 3 days in rock-lined pits. So, there's a plant growing here in Boise, not in the wild like some of my previous photos, but that's what the root of the arrowleaf balsam root looks like if you harvest it. So they can be quite robust. I've heard that they probably really sought the smaller plants. I don't know that though, but this shows up quite a large one here amongst these smaller ones, just to give you an idea of what's below ground. The Western or Saskatoon serviceberry, you can see here in the original specimen, is not looking so great anymore. Again, note all the annotation labels, but serviceberry, many of you maybe have eaten it. It's quite delicious, actually. Private Joseph Whitehouse, one of the people on the expedition, wrote in 1805, "Our interpreter's wife went on shore and found great number of fine berries, which is called serviceberries." And they must have just loved these. So nice to have a fruit and something kind of juicy and delectable amongst all the other kind of food that they had to eat often, which became, I'm sure, quite tiresome when they were able to get food, that is. Serviceberry is an excellent garden plant, wonderful for wildlife, pollinators, and you might have heard some old timers call it sarvisberry, which is how Lewis referred to it in the journals. One of my all-time favorites here is beargrass. I used to live in Montana for a while, where we have quite a lot of Xerophyllum tenax growing up in the mountains. You can actually recognize the flower of beargrass here on this original specimen, which is kind of nice to see. And tenax is the term for tenacious for the plant's strong leaves. But I want you to also look at these roots, these long-lived plants. These were plants I had purchased for the garden here in Boise. This is what beargrass looks like if you aren't familiar with it. It is in the lily family, or at least it used to be. Botanists might have moved it into a new family lately, but I always thought of it as a lily family member. That's how I learned it. But it was a very important plant for the leaves. I don't have a good photo of the leaves here, but it was used for basketry extensively. And in fact, beargrass is also known as Indian basket grass. So wonderful plant of the higher mountains. You pick this up if you go north of Salmon, up in the mountains, flowers in the summertime. You can see it was collected here in mid-July of 1806. And then a photo here to show you what a basket might look like, woven with beargrass, the finer material, and then yucca leaves for the more coarse material. Again, very important plant for basketry, perhaps other uses as well. Golden currant, Meriwether Lewis collected it on July 29th in 1805 and talked about the fruit, which you can see here, and how he enjoyed eating the fruit and found it to be even more pleasant tasting than those that he was familiar with growing in the garden. There it is, the golden currant, or Ribes aureum, in full flower, fall color, to give you an idea of how beautiful that plant is, how prolific it can be in producing the fruits, and then that beautiful kind of waxy leaf and flower that it produces, usually in late March over here in the Boise area. So quite an early flower, flowers into April. Prickly pear cactus, plains prickly pear, starvation prickly pear, is a very widespread species. There are no cactus specimens, even though they ran across several different genera and species during the expedition, but they have none represented in the herbarium collections that were brought back. And I love this quote by Meriwether Lewis: "The prickly pear is now in full bloom and forms one of the beauties as well as the greatest pests of the plains." And if you read any of the accounts, you'll know that when they did the portage around the Great Falls in Montana, or on the Missouri River, which took about a month, they had to repair their shoes every night and rid them, get the prickly pear spines out of their shoes. So it was a very difficult plant, but yet he was able to expound a little bit on the beauty of it as well. The beautiful flowers can be either pink or yellow. And I believe this is my last plant, prairie smoke or old man's whiskers, a gorgeous plant, especially if you ever see a meadow of it. It's a very widespread plant. The light green shows its range. This feathery seed head persists and gives it the name prairie smoke. And you can see it in quite extensive meadows up in the mountains. It was first collected in the Weihite Prairie near Camii in June of 1806. So, and I included this link, and obviously you're not going to write that down, but if it's recorded, maybe you can go back to this or just type in ArcGIS Lewis and Clark route. This shows, it's kind of a neat site where it shows the route, and if you there's a lot of dots along the route that they traveled, both going west and then back east, and you can click on those dots and it will show you what plants were collected at that location and gives you information about those species. Another view of the beautiful, this is in the rose family also, so wonderful little plant. When the Lewis and Clark Garden in Boise was dedicated in 2006, we had a couple of Native American women do a ceremony, a blessing ceremony, and it was just a wonderful event. And really, the garden has grown quite a bit now since the plantings were done in the mid 2000s or so. Not only at the Idaho Botanical Garden, but also at the Orton Botanical Garden here in Boise. I prepared, Tom and I just talked last night on the phone kind of late, put together this list that we came up with off the top of our head. We've probably missed a few, but this is, I believe, 18 or 19 species that were, that some of which we've talked about tonight, that were collected by Meriwether Lewis and during the Expedition Corps of Discovery that are represented at the Orton Botanical Garden right there in Twin Falls. And so it's a pretty extensive list. Very neat to know that all those plants are represented there. I believe there's over 400, maybe 450 or so species in that garden, including this long list of plants that were first collected and many of them new to science by Meriwether Lewis. So with that, this is broom snakeweed, one of the plants on the expedition growing at the Orton Botanical Garden, this little yellow flower plant in the meadow area. So hopefully Tom and I will be able to take some questions before Lamar wanted to make just a few little comments about the garden. Of course, Lamar Orton is and Rosalie started the garden. And but first, I think we wanted to try to do questions, Tom and I. So let me see if Tom can get back on and we can see what we have here.
Okay, there are a couple of questions I have here for you.
Okay.
One is, what was the name of the book you spoke of, authored by the Idaho author from Sun Valley?
It's let me get it out.
Okay. I think I wrote it down. It's called Lewis and Clark's Green World. Is that correct?
It is Lewis and Clark's Green World, the Expedition and its Plants. Scott Earl and James Reveal, 2003. Scott Earl also wrote Central Idaho Wildflowers. I think a little bit before this came out, and several volumes of that have come out since. So both, they're similar format books. Both are beautiful. He was an incredible photographer, lived up in Sun Valley for a time. And so anyway, yes, it's a wonderful reference to have.
Can you show us the cover? You pulled the book out, didn't you?
Okay.
There we go. Yes. Okay.
Oh, okay. I haven't done that before. Okay.
Great. And there, I had the question about, was there Clarkia or bitterroot at the Orton, but I think you pretty much answered that.
Yeah.
You mentioned many of the plants that are at Orton Botanical Garden. Are there any other questions that you can unmute now and feel free to ask? No questions?
No
Well,
questions?
some beautiful photos from both of you and lots of great information. It was so interesting. Thank you. I wanted to know who, if any of you, even people who are signed on here, have eaten, say, some of the things that Lewis and Clark talked about eating. The bitter root, the camas. And did you ever get a chance to taste it?
I did not. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I have not eaten bitter root. I have eaten camas. It's quite good. And I have eaten Indian potato. They also collected a couple of different alliums, Allium gyri, and another one. I've tried the wild onion a little bit. Those are delicious. I have not eaten Indian potato. So I have sampled a few. Yeah.
Did you think they mostly ate things raw or, like those plants?
I think they probably cooked them, and especially with Sacagawea along, she must have shown them how to cook the materials, because I think usually they would probably taste better if they were cooked.
Mhm. Great. Tom, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, simply to go back to your question, of course, a lot of the sweeter things, the golden currants, the service berries, even
that's true.
the Mahoney aquifolium, the Oregon grape, they're quite delicious, either raw or turned into jelly or syrup.
Mhm.
Oh, and of course, golden currant is delicious. Yeah.
Is it? I have some golden currant. I've never eaten them. I'll
Yeah.
have to try them. And I have service berry. So you can make jelly out of that?
Yep, you can make jelly. There's also chokecherry, which was one of the Lewis and Clark plants. Commonly, people make jelly or jam out of that, and chokecherry syrup, things like that. You have to add a lot of sugar, of course. But the service berry you can just eat as is, and they're delicious.
We had one other question regarding Lewis's flax. It doesn't look strong enough to be used as cordage, but I understand that was a use. Have you seen things that have been made from this plant?
I can at least say this, that Lewis has thought that this might have great commercial value, never panned out, either for cordage or for fabric.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was curious about that too. Another question, how did they distinguish edible versus poisonous plants?
Well, I think they had Sacagawea and probably many of the indigenous people that they met along the way to kind of share that information with them.
Yeah, it's very clear in the journals that every place they stopped, they tried to talk to Native Americans and fur traders and get as much information as they could about what they were getting into, both the terrain and what was available, what game would be available, and what plants that were edible and what plants they needed to be careful of.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, we're going to go to Lamar. Lamar, do you want to unmute? And there you are.
Okay.
Hi, Lamar.
Hi. I just want to take just a minute and just thank Tom and Ann for their excellent presentation on Lewis and Clark. I really, really appreciate it. I also wanted to thank Vicki for hosting us tonight. We will, Orton Botanical Garden, we will continue to have classes and tours and sales in our garden. And I just wanted to mention that if you have any questions about activities, please take a look at our website and also our Facebook, and because that's where the information is put on up for people to view. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that if you're a member of the garden, you will receive quarterly newsletters about the garden and activities at the garden. Also, we have a plant sale for our members, specifically when we start our plant sale in May. We have a half a day before the regular plant sale starts for members alone. So if you're interested at all in becoming a member, you can go onto our website, go to the page called membership, and you can actually sign on there or download a form to become a member. We also have a reciprocal agreement with other gardens. It's through the American Horticultural Society. And if you're a member of Orton Botanical Garden, then you're able to get the card that allows you to enter either at reduced rate or for free in close to 400 other gardens throughout the United States. So if you're interested in that, like I say, you can take a look at our website and see if you're at all interested in becoming a member. So that, and thank you again for being with us tonight, and thanks again to Ann, Vicki, and Tom for what they've done.